Ghost Planes. Written by Kanefan701. Read and adapted for audio by TARDIS9. As the summer season progressed, the railways on Sodor got very busy, and continued to do so as more and more visitors came. Percy's return to the railway was still in preparation, but the date showed that he had 3 weeks to go until then. During this stage, he was nearing the end of his overhaul when his boiler passed its steam test. Nearing completion of reassembly at the East Lancashire Railway's workshops in Bury, he was repainted in his NWR green livery, with NWR red and yellow lining. His reassembly would be completed within the next 2 weeks. The Sodor Airport, which was built in 2005, was being filled and emptied by hundreds of people who came from around the world. They came aboard planes from different companies such as British Airways and American Airlines. Sodor's only passenger plane was Jeremy. He was based on a British Aircraft Corporation 111 airliner, BAC for short. They were also known as the BAC 31 or the BAC 111. The first flight was on August 20th, 1963 and was introduced to service in 1965. The aircraft was one of the most successful British airliner designs and served until a widespread retirement in the 1990s, which was partly due to the introduction of aircraft noise restrictions in many European nations. Jeremy, however, was only a replica of the 111 airliner, but he felt that it was an honour to show Sodor what these planes were like. However, on this summer season, the Sodor airport was handling more traffic than usual. Some of the largest aircrafts, such as the Boeing 747, the Boeing 777, the MD-11 and the Airbus 330 were landing at the airport. James and Emily were amazed. They had heard of these planes, but never thought they'd see them here on their own island. "Those are huge," Emily said. "No wonder we're having more visitors to the railway," said James. "And from the looks of things, this'll be the most busiest summer ever." "That's definitely for sure," Emily said. "I wonder what the Fat Controller would think." James laughed slightly at the thought. One night, Jeremy was in his hangar, about to undergo maintenance. 30 inspectors and mechanics were going to spend the night making sure that he was fit to fly. Whenever passenger planes land at an airport, they are examined every time they come to a stop. This is the A-check. A brief walk-around inspection turns up the most obvious problems. The more intensive work is done in hangars. These are the B and C checks. Tonight, the workers were going to perform a C check on Jeremy. From start to finish, it would require hundreds of man-hours of work. This all had to be finished during the night, so that Jeremy could get back to flying again in the morning. This was a massive challenge, because modern airliners were made of hundreds and thousands of individual pieces. While Jeremy was being inspected, he heard the sound of another aircraft. He looked up, and there he saw a medium to long-range, twin-engined, wide-body jet airliner. "That's one of the few planes I've seen flying over tonight," he said. "There hasn't been that many for the past 2 days." As he watched the plane approach the airport, he saw it coming in to land on the runway. But as Jeremy blinked his eyes and looked away for a few seconds and then looked back, the plane had gone. Vanished into thin air. "What the?" he said, confused and bewildered. Where's the plane gone?" "What's the matter?" asked one of the mechanics. "I saw a jet airliner and it was coming to land and now it's gone," Jeremy said. "Well, we didn't hear the sound of a plane coming, nor did anyone else see one," said another mechanic. Your mind must have played a trick on you. Jeremy was convinced he saw a plane, but now he started to think that it could have been a hallucination. By the next morning, his sea check was completed and he was back flying, and the weather conditions could not have been so perfect. The sun was shining and only a few clouds filled the air. But throughout the day, Jeremy kept on thinking about what had happened last night. When dusk fell, he was to take passengers home on a short flight from Sodor to London. But due to a 30-minute delay, he fell behind schedule and darkness was beginning to close in. When Jeremy was given clearance to taxi to the runway, the sky got a little hazy. The control tower then gave him takeoff position, and he started to speed down the runway. Jeremy lifted off after reaching V1. He made a smooth flight with no problems whatsoever and landed at London nearly 40 minutes late. On the return journey, Jeremy was loaded with cargo, mail, and carrying 132 passengers. The weather was still slightly hazy, but air traffic control reported that heavy rain showers 20 miles east from Sodor were on the move and closing in fast, with a violent gust of wind and a chance of thunderstorms. Hoping to beat the bad weather, Jeremy's crew decided to leave quickly. Air traffic control gave them full clearance to take off. It was 11:03 p.m. by the time Jeremy levelled off at his cruising altitude. He made perfect flying all the way until he reached Sodor Airport. The bad weather had beaten him earlier by 40 minutes. Wind and rain was hammering the runway. Other aircraft were there, queuing to take off. However, the weather got worse as thunderstorms formed and began to roll through. Lightning started to hammer the runway, as well as becoming a great threat. It had already forced the airport authorities to declare a red alert. This meant that the chance of being struck by lightning was so great that ground crews were not allowed to work on the planes. Jeremy was put into a holding pattern and circled around the airport for 30 minutes before being given the clearance to land. As Jeremy made his landing attempt, he got pounded by the heavy rain and the winds blew violently against him. He managed to get through the bad thunderstorm and could just about see the runway of Sodor Airport due to lack of visibility. I'll be glad to be on the ground once this is over with, Jeremy said, struggling to see. Then, as his landing gear wheels touched the runway, he gasped in horror. Up ahead of him was another passenger plane. "Control! There's another aircraft ahead!" he cried out. "Abort landing! Abort landing!" But there was no time to abort the landing, and Jeremy was now slipping on the runway. He shut his eyes as he prepared to crash into the other plane. But as he was inches away from colliding, the plane vanished. Jeremy's crew were able to stop him just in time before he slid off the end of the runway. When Jeremy opened his eyes, he was stunned, bewildered, and very shaken. His pilots were feeling the same way. But the flight attendants and passengers were all wondering what had happened and why Jeremy had gone almost out of control. Jeremy was taken to his hangar, where Thomas the Tank Engine was waiting outside with the Fat Controller, who was called in after the incident struck an hour ago. The weather was starting to improve, but it was still raining. In the hangar, all of the passengers and crew wanted to know what had happened and how close they came to near disaster. "It has come to my attention that a strange occurrence had happened when Jeremy attempted to land on the runway at Sodor Airport," the Fat Controller said as he began. "I'm sure you've all experienced this." "Oh, whatever it was, it certainly felt nearly real," said Jeremy's captain. "Was it some sort of ghost? Was it some sort of ghost?" asked the co-pilot. Small mumbles from the passengers began to spread around as the Fat Controller looked on. "Sir," said Jeremy, "the night before I saw another plane and it was coming into land and that too vanished. I don't understand. Why are strange things happening at Sodor Airport? The Fat Controller paused briefly. What you saw were two lost spirits, he said. The aircrafts were flights 1205 and 686. They were two passenger jets owned by two rival companies, Boeing and Airbus. Flight 1205 was a Boeing 747, one of the oldest in the fleet, serving for British Airways. He was very loyal and deeply respected by others. Flight 686 was an Airbus A310, serving for Air Transat. It turned out that both he and Flight 1205 were good friends, despite being rivals. They had no problems whatsoever, and both enjoyed flying while making their companies proud. Their bond was strong, and would be, until the very end. What happened to them? Asked one of the flight attendants. Did something bad happen? Asked another. The Fat Controller again paused briefly. It was during the summer of 2006, a year after Sodor Airport was opened, he said. Both planes were on different flights. Flight 686 was to depart from Sodor and fly to Hamburg, Germany, and then on to Paris, France. Flight 1205 was flying into Sodor after taking off from New York, USA. The weather at that time was bad, and many planes were being queued to take off or trying to come into land. The controllers in the tower were having a hard time, but did their best to carry on. Flight 1205 was one of many preparing to land at the airport, but had been put into two holding patterns. His crew were desperate to land due to the fuel running out in the engine's tanks. Meanwhile, Flight 686 was among the many planes waiting to take off. He was taxiing to the runway, but was put in hold to wait for an incoming plane, which was Flight 1205, who had been granted permission by air traffic control to enter the airport and land. However, with the bad weather, his crew underestimated it and made a series of errors that would seal his fate. He landed on the runway, but he started sliding out of control. His crew armed his spoilers and powered up his reverse thrusts, but it was all too late. Flight 1205 crashed right into the path of his good friend Flight 686 side on. I'm sorry to say that both planes never saw each other coming. Everyone, including Thomas and Jeremy, was horrified. Sir, was this all just a normal air crash accident? Thomas asked quietly. The Fat Controller just shook his head. It was a disaster, and still remains the worst air crash in Sodor Airport's history, he said. Most of the passengers on board Flight 686 died, including his pilots. Flight 1205, after crashing, was broken into two pieces and caught fire after he went off the runway. His captain and first officer survived, but I'm afraid that some of his passengers didn't make it. Shortly after the accident, investigators went to work to find out what caused this tragedy. It was concluded in their final report that bad weather, pilot error, and air traffic control communication were to blame. What happened then? Asked Jeremy. Flight 1205's pilots were given a full-year suspension and made to redo their flight training, said the Fat Controller. The air traffic controller was suspended for 6 months, while safety charges were made to the airport and the technology was upgraded. But after the aftermath, rumours from the control towers said that 2 planes were either sighted at the airport or heard on their control tapes, requesting permission for them to land or take off. It is said there is the ghosts of Flights 1205 and 686. However, after the airport at Sodor was fully updated, The strange occurrences seem to have gone. That is, until now. Everyone looked at the Fat Controller silently and sadly. Like they say, you can never hide away from the past, the Fat Controller said gravely. Everyone in the hangar was lost in their thoughts. Thomas took the passengers home in Annie and Clarabelle, while Jeremy stayed in his hangar, undergoing a B check by 40 inspectors and mechanics. Since the telling of the tragic story of Flights 1205 and 686, he has become deeply touched and scared. He knows that the two were still friends to this day, even after their deaths, and hopes to see them one day. The Sodor airport continues to bring more visitors to the railway, but with this story of the tragic accident that took place so long ago, it has revealed its scars and its legacy, a legacy that many of the Fat Controller's engines never knew about.